Arthur Sterling was sitting on his sofa in his quiet Oak Park home, deeply immersed in a documentary about the history of financial fraud, when Julian Vance stormed into the living room like a sudden, aggressive storm. Without a word, Julian reached behind the television and ripped the cable out with a sharp tuck. "Enough of this intellectual rot, Arthur," Julian announced with a sneer of superiority. "In this house, we cultivate higher standards. We watch things of substance." The sting of the words was nothing compared to the sight of Claire standing right behind him. After 18 months of living under Arthur's roof for free, his own daughter didn't utter a single word in his defense. Instead, she avoided his eyes and gave a small, mechanical nod of agreement with her husband. Arthur didn't argue. He didn't shout. He simply stood up and retreated quietly to his study upstairs. But that night, the retired forensic accountant made one final, cold calculation. The next morning, the moment their car cleared the driveway, Arthur made a phone call, a call to someone who would dismantle their world piece by piece. When Julian and Claire returned that evening, all they could do was scream and pound frantically on a door that would never open for them again. The echo of the television cable hitting the hardwood floor seemed to vibrate through the soles of Arthur's slippers as he climbed the stairs. Each step felt like a heavy entry in a ledger of grievances he had been keeping for 547 days. 18 months of Julian's expensive cologne suffocating the scent of Martha's lavender sachets. 18 months of being told that his 69 years of experience were obsolete in the new economy of influencers and crypto speculators. When Arthur reached the landing, he paused to catch his breath. The hallway was lined with photographs of a life that felt like it belonged to a different man. There was Arthur and Martha at the Grand Canyon in 1995. There was Claire at her graduation from medical school, her smile bright and untainted by the shadow of the man she would eventually marry. Arthur looked at the photo of his daughter and felt a hollow ache in his chest. He wondered at what point the brilliant girl who could diagnose a complex psychological disorder had become a puppet for a man who could not even balance a checkbook. He entered his study and closed the door, turning the lock with a soft, decisive click. This room was the only sanctuary Julian had not yet managed to colonize. Julian had already turned the dining room into a makeshift office filled with whiteboards and meaningless buzzwords like synergy and disruptive growth. He had claimed the garage for his leased Mercedes, forcing Arthur's reliable sedan onto the curb where the autumn leaves of Oak Park gathered like rust. But Julian was afraid of this room. He was afraid of the rows of leather-bound tax codes and the cold, unyielding logic of a forensic auditor's library. The air in the study was cool. Julian had insisted on setting the thermostat to 64 degrees to optimize cognitive performance, a thinly veiled excuse to save money on Arthur's utility bill while Julian spent thousands on artisanal water and silk pocket squares. Arthur did not turn on the overhead light. He sat in the darkness, watching the shadows of the oak trees dance across the ceiling. He thought back to the day they arrived. Julian had lost his third luxury apartment in 2 years, citing a temporary liquidity crisis caused by a jealous business partner. Arthur had opened his doors because that is what fathers do. He had ignored the red flags in Julian's erratic financial stories because he wanted to be close to Claire. He had traded his dignity for proximity, and tonight, he realized the exchange had been a bankruptcy of the soul. Arthur stood up and walked to the closet behind his desk. He reached into the dark recesses of the top shelf and pulled out a black leather briefcase. It was heavy, a relic from his decades at the Internal Revenue Service. This was the same briefcase he had carried when he unmasked the offshore accounts of a corrupt senator in 2008. It was the tool of a man who knew that people might lie, but the numbers never did. He set the briefcase on the desk. The leather felt cool and pebbled beneath his fingers. Inside were the ghosts of his career, the meticulous habits of a man trained to find a needle of fraud in a haystack of deception. He opened the latches, the metallic snap sounding like a gavel hitting a block. He did not need a computer yet. He pulled out a fresh yellow legal pad and a fountain pen. At the top of the page, he wrote the date in his precise, cramped handwriting. Underneath it, he wrote a single word, audit. He spent the next 4 hours in total silence, reconstructing the last 18 months. He visualized the mail Julian had intercepted, the way Julian's eyes would shift when the property tax notices arrived, and the suspicious number of luxury deliveries that showed up at the door despite Julian claiming he was between ventures. Arthur's mind was no longer that of a grieving widower. The fog of sorrow that had clouded his judgment since Martha's funeral was finally lifting, replaced by the sharp, icy clarity of a professional hunter. Julian Vance thought he was playing a game of chess against a man who did not know the rules. He did not realize that Arthur Sterling had spent 40 years taking down men far more dangerous and far more intelligent than a failed investment coach with a leased car. Julian had mistaken Arthur's kindness for weakness and his silence for senility. It was a common mistake among predators who believed their own lies. As the clock on the mantel struck 2 in the morning, Arthur reached into the secret compartment of his briefcase and pulled out a small, encrypted thumb drive. It contained the contact information for his old network, the men and women who still owed him favors from his days in the field. He looked at the phone on his desk. He wanted to call right then, but he knew the value of timing. A successful audit required a surprise inspection. He walked to the window and looked down at the street. The quiet beauty of Oak Park felt fragile, threatened by the parasite living in his guest room. He thought about Claire. He wondered if she truly believed the intellectual rot Julian spoke of, or if she was simply too exhausted to fight back. Regardless, he knew that the only way to save her was to burn the bridge she was standing on. Arthur laid down on the small cot he kept in the study, but he did not sleep. He watched the sun begin to bleed through the curtains, a pale gray light that heralded the end of his passivity. He felt a strange sense of peace. The numbers were already beginning to align. The discrepancies were being noted. The final audit of the Vance household had officially begun, and Arthur Sterling was prepared to follow the trail of crumbs all the way to the end, no matter who it hurt or what it cost to reclaim his home. The garage door hummed as it closed, a sound that usually signaled the beginning of Arthur's daily isolation. But this morning, as the silver Mercedes pulled away and Claire's sedan followed, Arthur did not settle into his chair. He stood by the kitchen window, his reflection in the glass appearing sharper, less bowed by the weight of 18 months of quiet submission. The forensic instinct, a dormant predator that had lived in the back of his mind for 4 decades, was fully awake. He began with the trash. Julian was many things, but he was not disciplined. He believed Arthur was a relic, a man whose cognitive abilities had vanished with the invention of the smartphone. This arrogance was Julian's greatest vulnerability. Arthur walked to the side of the house where the large rolling bin stood. He pulled on a pair of thin latex gloves he had kept in his cleaning supplies, a habit from his days auditing crime scenes where a single fingerprint could invalidate a year of work. The recycling bin was a goldmine of pretension. Arthur sifted through empty bottles of imported spring water and boxes from luxury boutiques in downtown Chicago. Then, his fingers brushed against a cluster of confetti. Julian had a small personal shredder in the dining room, but he was lazy. He had shredded a stack of documents horizontally, leaving long, legible strips of paper. Arthur gathered them into a plastic bag with the patience of a man who had once reconstructed a burned ledger for the Department of Justice. Back inside, Arthur avoided the living room where the severed cable still lay like a dead snake. He went to the dining room, Julian's self-proclaimed headquarters. The air here was thick with the scent of synthetic sandalwood and the stale grease of expensive takeout. The white boards were covered in diagrams of wealth funnels and high-yield circles, the hollow geometry of a con artist. Arthur ignored the boards and went straight for the mahogany sideboard that Julian had claimed for his files. It was locked, a simple wafer tumbler lock that Julian likely thought was impenetrable. Arthur reached into his pocket and pulled out a small piece of spring steel he had fashioned from a binder clip earlier that morning. With a gentle twist and a soft click, the drawer slid open. Inside were neat rows of folders, most of them empty or filled with glossy brochures for investment schemes. But tucked behind a stack of tax manuals was a slim, unmarked blue folder. Arthur carried the folder to the kitchen table, where the light was better. As he opened it, his heart did not race. It slowed, his pulse becoming the steady, rhythmic beat of a man watching a predictable pattern emerge. The first page was a credit card statement. At the top, in bold letters, was the name Arthur Sterling. But the address was not his Oak Park home. It was a post office box in a neighboring town. Arthur looked at the account number. He did not recognize it. He had only 2 cards, both of which were tucked safely in his wallet. This was a new account, opened 6 months ago. His eyes scanned the transactions, his mind automatically categorizing them into columns of fraud. $3,000 at a bespoke tailor. $1,200 at a high-end steakhouse. $5,000 for a wellness retreat in Sedona. As he turned the pages, the numbers began to scream. $8,000 for a watch. $2,000 for a lease payment on a vehicle. The total at the bottom of the most recent statement was $47,482. Arthur felt a cold, crystalline anger settling in the marrow of his bones. While Julian had stood in the living room and lectured him about intellectual rot and higher standards, he had been using Arthur's credit score to fund a life of hollow luxury. Julian had not just moved into Arthur's house, he had moved into Arthur's identity, draining the legacy he had built over 40 years of honest labor. He turned to the next document in the folder. It was a letter from a bank, confirming the change of address for Arthur's primary savings account. The signature at the bottom was a masterpiece of deception. It looked exactly like Arthur's fluid, slightly shaky script. To an untrained eye, it was authentic. But to Arthur, the man who had signed his name to thousands of federal affidavits, the pressure of the pen was wrong. It was too deliberate, too calculated. The betrayal went deeper than the money. Arthur looked at the date on the address change. It had happened 3 days after Julian and Claire moved in. Julian had been planning this from the moment he crossed the threshold, treating Arthur's grief as an open door to his bank account. Arthur closed the folder. The silence of the house no longer felt oppressive, it felt like a canvas. He thought of Claire, her mechanical nod, her refusal to meet his eyes. Did she know? Had she seen the new suits and the expensive watch and believed Julian's lies about a sudden windfall? Or was she a silent partner in the slow erasure of her own father? The thought was a jagged stone in his throat, but he pushed it down. A forensic accountant could not afford the luxury of emotion during an audit. He needed more. He needed to find the debt that was driving this desperation, and he knew exactly where Julian would hide the bodies. Arthur stood up, the blue folder tucked under his arm. He had the first layer of the fraud. Now, he was going to peel back the rest, and he was going to do it with the same quiet, devastating precision that had once made him the most feared auditor in the Chicago district. Julian Vance had wanted a house of substance. He was about to find out that the most substantial thing in this home was the man he had tried to bury. Arthur sat at his desk, the blue folder open before him like a patient on an operating table. To an amateur, the $47,000 of fraudulent charges were the crime, but to Arthur Sterling, they were merely the symptoms. He knew that fraud of this magnitude required a catalyst, a desperate hunger that could never be satisfied. He opened his old laptop, the fan whirring like a tired heart, and began the digital portion of the audit. Numbers were a language Julian Vance spoke with a heavy accent of lies, but Arthur had spent 40 years translating such dialects into the plain truth. He started by cross-referencing the luxury purchases with Julian's public business profile. Ascent Wealth Partners was the name Julian used on his business cards, a grand title for a company that had no physical office and no registered employees. Arthur traced the corporate filing through the state database and found that the company had been flagged 3 times for failure to disclose assets. As Arthur dug deeper into the electronic trail, he discovered a series of recurring payments from his hijacked savings account to a private equity firm in the Cayman Islands. The amounts were precise: $5,000 on the first of every month for the last 6 months. It was a classic pyramid structure, a multi-level marketing scheme disguised as high-yield offshore investing. Julian was not just a thief, he was a gambler playing with stolen chips, trying to buy his way into a circle of wealth that did not exist. The most chilling discovery came when Arthur accessed his property tax portal. He found a pending lien on his Oak Park home, a notification he had never received because Julian had likely intercepted the physical mail. Julian had applied for a home equity line of credit for $200,000 using Arthur's forged signature and a fabricated power of attorney document. The application claimed the funds were for home improvements and medical expenses for an elderly relative. Arthur felt the blood turn to ice in his veins. The house was not just real estate, it was the place where Martha had spent her final days, where every scratch on the floorboards told a story of 30 years of marriage. Julian was auctioning off Arthur's memories to pay back a group of angry investors who were breathing down his neck. A quick search of private litigation databases revealed that Julian was currently the defendant in 4 separate civil suits totaling over $300,000. The picture was now complete. Julian was a drowning man, and he had decided to use Arthur as a life raft, even if it meant pushing him under the water to stay afloat. He was using the stolen credit cards to maintain the appearance of success, buying the silk suits and the expensive watches to lure in new victims for his Ascent Wealth scam. He was a predator who had run out of territory and had turned to cannibalizing his own family. Arthur leaned back, the blue light of the monitor reflecting in his glasses. He looked at the legal pad where he had listed Julian's debts in 2 columns. The total was staggering. Julian owed more than he could ever earn in a lifetime of honest work. He was a man built entirely of hollow promises and leveraged debt, a walking bankruptcy disguised as a visionary. The emotional weight of the betrayal was a heavy stone, but Arthur used his training to compartmentalize the pain. He knew that Julian's arrogance would be his undoing. Julian truly believed that Arthur was too old to understand the complexities of modern finance, too senile to notice a missing $200,000 of equity. He did not realize that while he had been practicing his speeches about intellectual rot, Arthur had been quietly tracing every cent, every forged signature, and every lie. Arthur reached for his phone and dialed a number he had not called in 3 years. It belonged to an old colleague at the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network. He did not ask for a favor yet. He simply asked for a verification on a specific routing number. When the answer came back, Arthur noted it down with a steady hand. The audit trail was now a noose, and the numbers had provided all the rope necessary. Julian Vance thought he was the architect of a new empire, but Arthur saw him for what he truly was, a rounding error that needed to be corrected. He closed his laptop and sat in the dark. The silence of the house no longer felt like a prison, but like an ambush. He was no longer just a father-in-law. He was an auditor who had found a massive discrepancy, and he was going to ensure that the books were balanced by any means necessary. The quiet of the afternoon was deceptive, a thin veneer of suburban peace that Arthur now recognized as the silence of a predator waiting for its prey. At 2 o'clock, the silver Mercedes had not returned, and Claire was safely ensconced in her shift at the hospital. Arthur walked into the dining room, the space Julian had converted into a shrine for his own ego. The air was stale, smelling of the expensive energy drinks Julian consumed by the case. There, sitting on the mahogany sideboard like an unguarded fortress, was Julian's laptop. Arthur did not hesitate. He had spent his career navigating the digital back alleys of offshore tax havens and encrypted ledgers. He sat in Julian's ergonomic chair, the leather still holding the faint warmth of a man who believed he was untouchable. He touched the trackpad. The screen flickered to life, requesting a password. Arthur looked at the whiteboard behind him, where Julian had scrawled his latest motivational mantras. In the corner, next to a diagram of a wealth funnel, was the word alpha followed by the number 1. Arthur typed in a password. The desktop icons appeared instantly. He went straight for the email client. He did not look at the personal messages or the newsletters for luxury yachts. He used the search bar, typing in a single word, Sterling. The results populated the screen in a long, damning list. Most were related to the fraudulent credit accounts Arthur had already discovered, but at the top of the list was a thread that made the blood in Arthur's veins turn to slush. The subject line read, Arthur Sterling, long-term care options. The exchange was with a woman named Susan Wickfield, a consultant at a place called Sunrise Meadows Senior Living and Memory Care. Arthur clicked the first message, dated 3 months ago. Hi Susan, Julian had written. Following up on our call. My father-in-law, Arthur, is showing significant signs of cognitive decline. He is becoming increasingly difficult to manage at home, often confused about dates and repeating himself. We are looking for a secure facility that can handle aggressive dementia cases. Arthur's hand gripped the mouse so hard his knuckles turned white. He had never been confused. He had never repeated himself. Every word was a calculated lie, a narrative Julian was weaving to justify a kidnapping sanctioned by the state. He scrolled down to Susan's response. We understand how challenging this can be for a family. To proceed, we require a medical assessment confirming the diagnosis, family consensus, and assigned power of attorney. The next email, sent only last week, contained an attachment. Arthur opened a PDF. It was a physician's assessment form, filled out with Arthur's full name, social security number, and date of birth. The diagnosis checked in the box was stage 2 Alzheimer's disease. The signature at the bottom belonged to a doctor Arthur had never met, likely a practitioner Julian had found in the same dark corners where he bought his investment leads. But the final email in the thread was the one that truly shattered Arthur's heart. Julian had written, My wife, Claire, is a doctor, as you know. She is fully on board with the transition. She is too emotional to handle the paperwork, so I am managing all the logistics. We need to move fast. Once Joseph is placed in your care and the power of attorney is finalized, the house at 42 Maple Drive can be sold to cover the costs. Property value is estimated at $800,000. After the initial deposit, the remaining funds will be managed by our family trust for his ongoing comfort. $800,000. The house Arthur and Martha had meticulously maintained for 30 years was being treated as a liquidation asset. Arthur was being priced out of his own life, his identity being erased by a medical forgery that would bury him alive in a memory care ward while Julian spent the equity on his failing MLM schemes. The mention of Claire's agreement was a jagged blade in Arthur's chest. He wanted to believe Julian was lying about her consent, but he remembered her mechanical nod on the sofa, her refusal to look him in the eye. Had Julian manipulated her into believing her father was actually losing his mind, or had she simply signed off on the convenience of his disappearance? The forensic accountant in Arthur took over. He could not afford to drown in the betrayal. He pulled a small encrypted USB drive from his pocket and began copying every email, every attachment, and every browser history link that pointed towards Sunrise Meadows. He captured the forged physician's report and the draft of the power of attorney document that Julian had likely planned to slip into a stack of tax papers for Arthur to sign. He discovered another folder labeled Exit Strategy. Inside were spreadsheets calculating the net profit from the sale of the Oak Park home after paying off Julian's $300,000 in debt. Julian had even researched furniture liquidators to empty the house the moment Arthur was moved. The level of detail was staggering. Julian had planned for everything, from the moving trucks to the specific ward where Arthur would be held. As the clock struck 3, Arthur heard the distant rumble of a car in the neighborhood. He moved with the practiced speed of an auditor closing a surprise inspection. He exited the mail program, cleared the recent file history, and put the laptop back into sleep mode. He stood up, his legs feeling heavy, and walked back to his upstairs study. He sat at his desk and held the USB drive in his palm. It was a tiny piece of plastic, but it contained enough evidence to destroy Julian Vance's life. Julian had looked at a 69-year-old man and seen a weak, grieving relic. He had missed the part where that man had spent 40 years taking down criminals who were far more sophisticated than a common con artist. Arthur looked at the photograph of Martha on his desk. He would not be moved. He would not be buried. Julian had spent 18 months trying to make Arthur disappear piece by piece, but he had made one fatal error. He had forgotten that the man he was trying to erase was the only person who knew exactly where all the numbers were buried. The conspiracy was no longer a secret. The audit was no longer just about money. It was about survival, and Arthur Sterling was now ready to move from the shadows into the light of the reckoning. The weight of the USB drive in Arthur's pocket felt like a live coal, a burning reminder of the betrayal that had moved from financial theft to a conspiracy against his very personhood. He did not wait for the evening to descend. At 9 o'clock the following morning, he drove to a small law office in downtown Chicago, away from the prying eyes of the Oak Park neighbors. The gold lettering on the door read Sam Kaplan, attorney at law. Sam was a man of 72 years with a face like a crumpled roadmap of legal battles. He and Arthur had worked together on some of the most complex corporate fraud cases of the 1990s. When Arthur walked in and laid the blue folder and the USB drive on the desk, Sam did not ask for a greeting. He saw the look in his old friend's eyes and reached for his reading glasses. For 60 minutes, the only sound in the room was the rustle of paper and the soft hum of the air conditioner. Sam reviewed the forged signatures, the credit card statements, and the chilling correspondence with Sunrise Meadows. When he finally looked up, his expression was one of controlled fury. "This is more than just a family dispute, Art," Sam said, his voice a low gravelly rasp. "This is identity theft, elder financial abuse, and a criminal conspiracy to commit you to a facility against your will. If we take this to the district attorney, Julian Vance is looking at 10 to 15 years. I want him out of my house, Sam," Arthur replied, his voice devoid of its usual softness. "I want him to realize that he never stood a chance against an auditor." Sam nodded, scribbling notes on a legal pad. "We need to be surgical," If you confront him now, he might destroy evidence or try to move up the commitment date. We need the audit trail to be airtight. First, you need to secure the assets. The next stop was the Oak Park branch of the Community First Bank. Arthur had been a customer there for 30 years, and the branch manager, a woman named Mrs. Gable, knew him well. When Arthur presented the evidence of the unauthorized credit accounts and the forged change of address forms, Mrs. Gable's professional veneer cracked. She immediately flagged the accounts and initiated a total freeze on any card bearing Arthur's name that had been issued in the last 6 months. We will also require voice verification for any transaction over $50, Arthur instructed, leaning forward. My son-in-law is not to have access to so much as a penny of my savings. Mrs. Gable complied, her fingers flying across the keyboard to build a digital wall around Arthur's life. As he walked back to his car, Arthur felt the first real surge of power he had known in 18 months. He was no longer a ghost in his own home, he was the primary investigator in a case of grand larceny. But he knew that a legal victory was only half the battle. He needed the social evidence to ensure that Julian could never play the victim. He spent the afternoon walking through his neighborhood, ostensibly checking on his garden and the autumn leaves, but his real goal was to speak with the people who had lived beside him for decades. He found Barbara Peterson, who lived 3 doors down, trimming her hedges. Barbara had been Martha's closest friend. "Art, it is good to see you out," she said, though her eyes flickered with concern. "We have been worried. That young man of Claire's, he is quite a handful, isn't he?" Arthur smiled a tight, knowing smile. "Has he been giving you trouble, Barbara?" She lowered her shears. "He told my husband we needed to remove our oak tree because it was blocking the sunlight for his vision board. He actually threatened us with a lawsuit from his wealth firm. And Karen Phillips across the street told me he yelled at her for parking her minivan where his clients might see it. He acts like he owns the entire block, Art." Arthur pulled out a small digital recorder from his pocket. "Would you mind telling me more about these incidents, Barbara?" For the record, by the time the sun began to set, Arthur had recorded 4 separate accounts of Julian's harassment and professional intimidation from the neighbors. He had a log of every time Julian had blocked a driveway or insulted a long-term resident. Julian's arrogance had left a trail of witnesses who were more than happy to see him humbled. The final piece of the audit trail was the timing. Arthur returned home and sat in his dark kitchen, watching the clock. He needed a day when Julian and Claire would be away for at least 8 hours, a window of time large enough to execute a total eviction. Claire had a double shift at the hospital this coming Monday, and Julian had mentioned a high-stakes lunch in the city with a group of potential investors. Arthur opened his yellow legal pad and wrote at the top, Operation Monday. He began a checklist that included a master locksmith, a professional moving crew for a 3-hour contract, and a private security firm. He was going to perform a silent audit of his own home. He would categorize what was his and what was theirs, and by the time the sun went down on Monday, the discrepancy that was Julian Vance would be permanently removed from the ledger. He sat in the silence of the house, no longer a victim, but the auditor-in-chief, waiting for the markets to open so he could settle the debt once and for all. Monday morning arrived with a pale and indifferent sun that barely managed to cut through the thick autumn mist of Oak Park. Arthur stood by the window of his second-floor study, his hand resting on the cool glass as he watched the silver Mercedes rumble down the driveway at 8:15. Julian was wearing his most expensive charcoal suit, the one purchased with Arthur's hijacked credit line, likely preparing to perform his latest charade for a new set of victims. At 8:30, Claire's sedan followed, her taillights disappearing into the gray haze as she headed toward her double shift at the hospital. The house was finally silent, but it was no longer the silence of a man in retreat. It was the silence of a clean ledger. Arthur picked up his phone and dialed the number for Miller's high-security locksmiths, a firm he had vetted through Sand Kaplan. "I am ready," Arthur said when the dispatcher answered. At 9 o'clock sharp, a white van pulled into the driveway. A man named David stepped out, carrying a heavy toolkit and a series of high-grade biometric scanners. Arthur met him at the front door, his demeanor as professional and detached as if he were supervising a routine federal audit. "I want every entry point secured," Arthur instructed, walking David through the house. The front door, the back kitchen entrance, the garage, and the basement. "I want the old deadbolts removed and replaced with the smart locks we discussed. Keyless entry for me via fingerprint and a master code. No physical keys are to be left behind." David nodded, already beginning to unscrew the brass plate of the front door. "This system is top of the line, Mr. Sterling. It logs every attempt to open the door and sends an alert to your phone. If someone tries to use an old key or force the handle, you will know instantly." Arthur watched the technician work. The sound of the drill bit biting into the wood was a rhythmic, satisfying melody. For 18 months, Julian had treated this house like a conquered territory, changing the atmosphere and the rules to suit his own vanity. Now, with every turn of the screwdriver, Arthur was reclaiming the physical boundaries of his life. He felt a strange, cold peace. To an auditor, control was not about emotion, it was about the integrity of the perimeter. While David worked on the doors, Arthur went upstairs to the guest room, the space that had once been his primary office. He moved with a clinical efficiency that left no room for hesitation. He pulled 4 large, blue hardshell suitcases from the back of the linen closet. He laid them open on the bed that Julian and Claire had occupied, their scent of expensive laundry detergent and Julian's sandalwood cologne clinging to the air. He started with Julian's closet. He did not fold the clothes. He took the silk shirts, the designer jeans, and the tailored blazers and laid them into the suitcases in heavy, unceremonious layers. He gathered the Italian leather shoes and the rows of silk ties, items that represented $47,000 of stolen equity, and packed them away. He was not angry, he was simply moving a set of liabilities off his personal balance sheet. He moved to the dresser, cleared Julian's collection of watches and energy supplements, and swept them into the side pockets of the luggage. When he reached Claire's side of the room, he paused. He saw her nursing scrubs neatly folded and her stethoscope resting on the nightstand. For a moment, the father in him wanted to leave her things alone, to keep a door open for her return. But the auditor reminded him that Claire had chosen to stand behind the man who was trying to bury her father alive. In a forensic audit, there were no partial exemptions. He packed her belongings with more care than Julian's, but he packed them nonetheless. By 11 o'clock, the upstairs room was stripped of their presence. It looked like a hotel room after a guest had checked out, sterile and empty. Arthur dragged the 4 suitcases to the top of the stairs and navigated them down one by one. His 69-year-old joints protested the weight, but the adrenaline of the reckoning provided a strength he had not felt in years. He lined the suitcases up in the front hallway, 4 blue monoliths standing in a perfect row facing the door. He then went to the kitchen and gathered the few items of theirs that remained, a designer coffee machine Julian had insisted on and a set of crystal wine glasses. He placed them in a box on top of the luggage. David, the locksmith, signaled from the hallway. "We are all finished, Mr. Sterling. All 4 doors are secured. I have programmed your thumbprint and the master code into the encrypted hop. Would you like to test them?" Arthur walked to the front door. He placed his thumb against the small glass sensor. There was a faint electronic chirp, followed by the heavy, mechanical thud of the bolt retracting. It was the sound of total sovereignty. He tested the back door and the garage entrance, feeling the precision of the new steel mechanisms. The house was now a fortress, and he held the only set of digital keys. At noon, Arthur sat at the kitchen table and wrote a single check for the locksmith services, $3,400, a small price for the restoration of his dignity. After David left, Arthur walked through every room of his home. He looked at the walls he and Martha had painted, the floors they had refinished, and the windows that looked out over the quiet streets of Oak Park. The house felt lighter, as if a heavy, suffocating shroud had been lifted from the rafters. He went to his study and pulled out his yellow legal pad. He checked off the first 3 items on his list: change locks, pack belongings, secure perimeter. The next item was the most critical: notify authorities. He knew that Julian would not go quietly. Julian was a man who lived by the script of his own importance, and being denied entry to a house he believed he had already stolen would trigger a spectacular collapse. Arthur wanted that collapse to happen in front of an audience of police officers and neighbors. He wanted the documentation to be public and irreversible. He sat in his leather chair and watched the clock. The countdown to the evening return had begun. He was no longer the man who watched documentaries in silence while his cable was ripped from the wall. He was the man who had performed the final audit, and he was now waiting for the subjects of the investigation to arrive and face the results. The Oak Park fog had lifted, and the air was now cold, clear, and ready for the storm. Arthur Sterling sat in the darkened living room, the only illumination coming from the amber streetlights filtering through the heavy oak trees. He watched the driveway with the clinical focus of a hawk. At precisely 6:07, the silver Mercedes rumbled into view, followed closely by Claire's sedan. The sound of the car doors slamming echoed through the silent house, a familiar rhythm that usually signaled the beginning of Arthur's nightly disappearance into the shadows. Tonight, however, the rhythm was about to break. He heard the heavy, arrogant footsteps of Julian Vance crossing the porch, followed by the tired, mechanical gait of his daughter. The brass handle of the front door rattled as Julian attempted to insert a key that no longer had a home. There was a moment of silence, then a more aggressive jiggle. Arthur remained motionless in his armchair, his hands folded over a thick, crimson accordion file. "Claire, did you change the code?" Julian's voice carried through the wood, sharp and annoyed. "The damn lock won't even accept the key." "Of course not, Julian," Claire replied, her voice strained with the exhaustion of a 12-hour shift. "Maybe the mechanism is frozen. It is an old house." "It is a neglected house," Julian snapped. He began to pound on the door, the sound thudding through the hallway where the 4 blue suitcases stood like sentinels. "Arthur, open the door. The lock is jammed." Arthur did not move. He listened as Julian's frustration escalated into a primal, entitled rage. The pounding became more rhythmic, more violent, vibrating the very frame of the house Martha had loved. Julian began to scream, his voice cracking with the indignity of being denied entry to a fortress he believed he had already conquered. "Arthur Sterling, I know you are in there. Open this door right now or I will kick it in." Across the street, the lights in Karen Phillips's living room flickered on. A curtain moved in Barbara Peterson's window. The audience was gathering, exactly as Arthur had calculated. At 6:15, the strobing red and blue lights of 2 Oak Park police cruisers began to paint the trees in alternating colors. Arthur had made the call the moment the Mercedes hit the driveway, reporting a domestic disturbance and a trespassing incident. Officer Reynolds and Officer Davis stepped onto the lawn, their hands resting near their belts. Julian turned toward them, his face a mask of sweating, scarlet fury. "Officers. Thank God you are here. My father-in-law has lost his mind. He has locked us out of our own home. He is acting erratic, possibly a stroke." Arthur stood up slowly. He adjusted his glasses and walked to the door. He placed his thumb on the biometric sensor, and the heavy bolt retracted with a metallic thud that seemed to silence Julian's shouting. Arthur opened the door exactly 6 inches, the heavy security chain holding firm. He looked out at the assembly on his porch, his face as calm and unyielding as a marble statue. "Good evening, Officer Reynolds," Arthur said, his voice level and professional. "I am Joseph Arthur Sterling, the sole owner of this property. I am the person who called you." "Arthur, stop this nonsense," Julian hissed, trying to shove his way into the gap. The chain held, a steel testament to the new security system. "You are confused. You are sick. Officers, he needs to be evaluated immediately." Arthur ignored the man and looked directly at the police. "Officer, I have prepared a comprehensive audit of the situation. I am a retired forensic accountant, and I have documented a series of criminal activities occurring within these walls." He reached through the gap and handed a thick stack of laminated documents to Officer Reynolds. The red folder contains evidence of $47,482 in fraudulent credit charges. It includes signature comparisons and merchant affidavits confirming that Julian Vance forged my name on at least 5 separate occasions. Julian's face went from red to a sickly, ashen gray. That is family money. We had an agreement." Arthur continued, his voice as cold as a winter wind. "The blue folder contains a digital trail of a conspiracy to commit me to a memory care facility through medical forgery. It includes an unauthorized power of attorney document and correspondence with Sunrise Meadows regarding the liquidation of this property for $800,000. Claire gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. She looked at Julian, then at her father, her eyes wide with a dawning, horrific realization. "Dad, what are you talking about?" "Read the emails, Claire," Arthur said softly, but with a firmness that allowed no interruption. "Officer Reynolds, you will also find a list of witness statements from the neighbors regarding Mr. Vance's patterns of harassment and intimidation. These people have no legal right to be on this property. They are not on the deed. They have not paid a single cent in rent or utilities for 18 months. In fact, they have been systematically draining my retirement accounts to fund a lifestyle of luxury." Officer Reynolds flipped through the pages, his expression hardening with every line of data he read. He looked at Julian, who was now backed against the porch railing, his eyes darting like a trapped animal. "Mr. Vance, do you have any documentation to refute these claims? Any proof of residency or rental agreements?" I am his son-in-law." Julian stammered, his intellectual mass crumbling into a pathetic, stuttering mess. "We are family. This is a private matter." "This is a felony matter, Mr. Vance," Reynolds replied. He looked at the 4 blue suitcases standing in the hallway behind Arthur. "It appears Mr. Sterling has already facilitated your departure. You and your wife are to collect these items and vacate the premises immediately. If you set foot on this lawn again tonight, I will arrest you for criminal trespass and felony fraud." The silence that followed was absolute. The neighbors watched from their porches as Julian Vance, the man who had lectured Arthur on higher standards and intellectual energy, was forced to grab his designer luggage and stumble toward his truck like a common thief caught in the act. Claire stood frozen, her scrubs wrinkled, her world collapsing into a pile of forensic evidence. Arthur looked at his daughter, the girl he had raised to be a doctor, now reduced to a bystander in her own husband's crimes. He felt a pang of sorrow, but he did not unhook the chain. The audit was complete. The discrepancy had been found. Arthur Sterling closed the door and turned the biometric lock, the sound of the bolts sliding home echoing through the house like the final period at the end of a long, dark sentence. He was no longer a victim, he was the owner of his life once more. The silence that followed the departure of the police cruisers was not the peaceful quiet Arthur had once known. It was the heavy, expectant stillness that occurred between the first strike of lightning and the inevitable crack of thunder. Arthur spent the evening hours moving through his reclaimed home with a methodical precision. He did not watch television. Instead, he sat in his study, the yellow legal pad in front of him, noting the time of every neighbor's supportive phone call and the exact sequence of events that had transpired on the porch. He knew that for a man like Julian Vance, the humiliation of a public eviction was a debt that would require a violent settlement. 6 miles away, in a cramped room at the Oak Towers weekly rental on the east side of town, Julian Vance was drowning his ego in a bottle of cheap bourbon. The room smelled of mildew and industrial cleaner, a far cry from the silk sheets and climate-controlled air of the Sterling residence. Julian stared at his reflection in the cracked bathroom mirror, seeing not a visionary investor, but a man who had been outmaneuvered by a pensioner he had called a relic. The $47,000 of stolen credit were gone, the accounts frozen by a single phone call. The $800,000 of home equity had vanished like a desert mirage. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the faces of the neighbors watching him carry his suitcases to his truck. The rage was a physical thing, a hot iron in his chest that burned away the last of his self-preservation. At precisely 2:15 in the morning, the silence of Maple Drive was shattered. Arthur was awake before the first piece of glass hit the floor. He did not scramble or panic. He reached for his smartphone, which was already connected to the high-definition feed of the new security system David had installed. On the screen, illuminated by the harsh white light of the motion sensors, Julian Vance was a specter of unhinged fury. He had parked his silver Mercedes crookedly across the curb, the driver's side door swinging open like a broken wing. He was swaying, his expensive charcoal suit jacket discarded somewhere in the mud, clutching a wooden baseball bat in his trembling hands. The first blow took out the mailbox. The wooden post, which Martha had decorated with hand-painted ivy 20 years ago, splintered into kindling under a drunken, overhead swing. Julian let out a slurred, guttural scream that echoed off the quiet houses of Oak Park. "You think you won, old man?" Julian shrieked at the darkened windows. "You think you can just erase me? This is my house. You are a ghost, Arthur. You are a dead man walking." Arthur stood at the upstairs window, his body shielded by the heavy velvet curtains. He tapped the record button on his phone, capturing every second of the descent. He watched as Julian stumbled toward the garage door, pulling a can of neon orange spray paint from his waistband. With jagged, trembling strokes, Julian began to deface the pristine white surface. He wrote the word senile in letters 3 feet high, followed by a series of crude, incoherent insults. To an auditor, this was not just vandalism, it was a signed confession of criminal intent. Julian moved to the front porch, his boots crunching over the shards of the terracotta flower pots he had kicked over. He swung the baseball bat against the living room window, the same window where Arthur had spent 18 months watching the world go by in silence. The glass exploded inward, a rain of crystal daggers falling onto the sofa. Julian was no longer an intellectual. He was a cornered animal, lashing out at the walls of the cage Arthur had built around him. Arthur remained on the line with the 911 dispatcher, his voice a low, steady whisper. "He is currently on the front porch," Arthur reported. "He is armed with a baseball bat and a crowbar. He is intoxicated and highly volatile. I am in the secure second-floor study. Please advise the officers that the subject has a history of erratic behavior." The sirens were faint at first, a distant wailing that Julian was too far gone to notice. He was now at the front door, jamming a crowbar into the frame of the new biometric lock. He was grunting with the effort, his face pressed against the wood, whispering threats into the crack of the door. "I am going to burn it down, Arthur. If I cannot have it, nobody can. I will put you in the ground myself." The red and blue lights appeared at the end of the block at 2:26 in the morning. They did not approach with a slow, deliberate pace this time. They surged forward, tires screeching as they cut off Julian's escape route. Officer Reynolds and Officer Davis were out of their vehicles before the engines had fully stopped. "Drop the weapon," Reynolds commanded, his voice a thunderclap that finally broke Julian's fever. "Drop it now." Julian spun around, the crowbar still gripped in his hand. He looked at the officers, his eyes wide and bloodshot, his mouth hanging open in a silent, jagged gasp. He tried to speak, tried to reassemble the mask of the sophisticated investor, but all that came out was a pathetic, drunken sob. He started to lunge toward the officers, a desperate, final act of defiance, but his foot caught on the broken remains of the mailbox. He went down hard on the concrete driveway, the crowbar clattering away into the darkness. Davis was on him in a second, his knee pinning Julian's shoulder to the pavement while the handcuffs clicked into place with a final, echoing snap. "Julian Vance, you are under arrest for felony vandalism, criminal trespassing, and violation of an emergency protective order," Reynolds announced, his voice devoid of any sympathy. "You have the right to remain silent." Arthur watched from the window as they hauled Julian to his feet. The charcoal suit was ruined, covered in mud and street grime. Julian's face was scratched from the fall, his hair matted against his forehead. He looked small. He looked like the fraud Arthur had always known him to be. As they pushed Julian into the back of the cruiser, Arthur looked down at his phone. 9 minutes and 42 seconds of high-definition footage. Every swing of the bat, every spray of paint, and every slurred threat was now a permanent entry in the official record. The red and blue lights faded as the cruisers drove away, leaving Maple Drive in darkness once more. Arthur walked downstairs, his footsteps echoing in the empty hallway. He looked at the broken glass and the orange paint on the garage, the physical evidence of a man's total collapse. He sat at his kitchen table and opened his legal pad. He drew a single, thick line through Julian's name. The subject of the audit had been neutralized. The debt was being collected. Arthur Sterling closed his eyes for a moment, the first real sleep in 18 months finally tugging at his mind, knowing that the man who tried to make him a ghost was now the one behind bars. The morning sun was a cold, clinical light that revealed the full extent of the damage to Arthur's sanctuary. He spent the early hours of Tuesday scrubbing the orange neon word senile from his garage door, the soaky water turning a sickly shade of rust as it hit the pavement. His hands were steady, his movements rhythmic, but his mind was busy calculating the emotional toll of the previous night. At 10 o'clock, the phone in his pocket vibrated. It was Sam Kaplan. "I have an update from the precinct," Sam began, his voice carrying a note of professional frustration. "Julian was released an hour ago. Claire showed up with $5,000 in cash for his bail." Arthur stopped scrubbing, the sponge dripping onto his shoes. $5,000. That was nearly the entire balance of Claire's personal emergency savings, a fund Martha had encouraged her to keep for herself. For a moment, the soaked suds on the driveway looked like a mountain of wasted potential. Claire was still trying to balance a ledger that had been insolvent for years. "She is at the Oak Towers rental with him now," Sam continued. "Art, I tried to talk to her. I told her about the protective order and the forensic evidence we gathered. She told me I did not understand their marriage. She said you pushed Julian to the edge." Arthur looked at the scratched surface of the garage door. He did not feel anger toward his daughter. He felt the deep, hollow sorrow of an auditor watching a client pour their final assets into a sinking ship. "She is not protecting a husband, Sam. She is protecting a lie she has told herself for 18 months. I will be ready when the call comes." The call came at 9:07 that evening. Arthur was sitting in the quiet of his study, the yellow legal pad open to a page labeled closing costs. When his phone lit up with Claire's name, his heart performed the frantic, irregular beat that defied his calm exterior. He answered on the first ring. "Dad, help me." The voice was a jagged whisper, stripped of the mechanical doctor's tone she had used for months. It was the sound of a woman who had finally reached the bottom of a very dark well. In the background, Arthur heard a crash of furniture and the slurred, predatory roar of Julian Vance. "I am in the bathroom," Claire sobbed, the sound muffled by wood and desperation. "The door is locked, but he is losing it, Dad. He says I betrayed him by not stopping the police. He says everything is my fault." "Where are you, Claire?" Arthur was already moving, his keys in his hand and his coat half on. "Oak Towers, 1247 Oak Street, apartment 3B. Please, Dad, he hurt me. He grabbed me and I should have listened. I should have listened to you about everything." The line went dead with the sickening sound of wood splintering under a heavy blow. Arthur did not hesitate. He did not even close his front door as he ran to his car. He dialed 911 as he reversed out of the driveway, the tires screaming against the asphalt of Maple Drive. "My daughter is being assaulted at 1247 Oak Street," Arthur told the dispatcher, his voice a low, terrifying growl of parental fury. "Her husband is Julian Vance. He is a violent felon out on bail. I am 3 minutes away and I am not waiting for you to arrive." Arthur drove through the streets of Oak Park like a man possessed, running 2 red lights and ignoring the speed limits he had respected for 50 years. He reached the east side of town where the brick buildings were taller and the streetlights were fewer. Oak Towers was a monument to neglect, a place where people went when they had run out of options. He ignored the elevator and took the stairs 2 at a time, his 69 old lungs burning with every breath. 3rd floor. Apartment 3B. The hallway was narrow and smelled of old grease and cheap cigarettes. Outside the door, a neighbor was standing with a phone to her ear, her face pale with fright. "He is going to kill her," the woman whispered as Arthur approached. Arthur did not answer. He did not knock. He threw his weight against the door, but it was reinforced with a heavy deadbolt. Inside, Julian was screaming, a high-pitched, delusional monologue about his stolen empire and Claire's disloyalty. "Open this door, Julian." Arthur roared, his fist hitting the wood with enough force to bruise his knuckles. "Go away, old man." Julian yelled back, his voice thick with bourbon and madness. "This is a private matter between a husband and his wife. She is a doctor, isn't she? She can fix herself." Arthur heard the bathroom door give way inside. The sound of Claire's scream was a sharp, cold needle in his soul. He looked at the neighbor. "Get back," he commanded. Arthur did not have a crowbar or a baseball bat. He had the weight of 18 months of humiliation and the terrifying clarity of a father whose child was in danger. He stepped back and kicked the door near the lock with every ounce of momentum in his body. The frame groaned. He kicked again, the wood screaming as it yielded. On the third strike, the door flew open. The apartment was a disaster. Suitcases were overturned, clothes were scattered across the floor, and a bottle of bourbon lay shattered in the kitchen. Julian was standing in the doorway of the bathroom, his hand gripped around Claire's wrist, pulling her toward the center of the room. Claire was on her knees, her face red and swollen, her scrubs torn at the shoulder. Julian spun around, his eyes wide and bloodshot. You ruined everything. You took my money. You took my house." Arthur did not move toward his daughter. He moved toward Julian. He did not look like a retired accountant. He looked like the reckoning itself. "You are a rounding error, Julian," Arthur said, his voice a low, lethal vibration. "You are a liability that has finally been liquidated." Julian lunged at Arthur, his movements clumsy and fueled by alcohol. Arthur stepped to the side with a surprising grace, grabbing Julian's arm and using the man's own momentum to shove him into the kitchen counter. Julian hit the edge hard, the air leaving his lungs in a sharp gasp. Before Julian could recover, the hallway was flooded with the light of flashlights. Officer Reynolds and 3 other officers burst into the room, their weapons drawn. "Get on the ground," Reynolds shouted, the authority in his voice filling the small apartment. "Get on the ground now." Julian collapsed, his strength evaporating the moment the law arrived. He sobbed into the carpet as the handcuffs were tightened around his wrists for the second time in 20 hours. He was no longer an intellectual. He was no longer a visionary. He was a small, broken man who had finally run out of lies. Arthur knelt on the floor next to Claire. He did not say "I told you so." He did not lecture her on the $5,000 she had wasted. He simply pulled her into his arms and let her cry into his chest. "I am so sorry," Claire whispered, her body shaking with deep, wrenching sobs. "I thought I could save him. I thought if I just tried harder, he would be the man I wanted him to be." "You cannot fix a fraudulent ledger, Claire," Arthur said gently, stroking her hair. "You can only close the books and start a new account. You are safe now." Paramedics arrived and began to tend to the bruises on Claire's face and arms. Officer Reynolds walked over to Arthur, his expression one of grim respect. "We have the witness statements from the neighbor and the recorded call from your phone, Mr. Sterling. The bail is revoked. He will not be getting out this time." Arthur watched as they dragged Julian from the room. Julian was still whispering about his rights, but nobody was listening. The audit of Julian Vance's life was over. The assets were gone, the debts were public, and the final balance was 0. Arthur helped Claire to her feet. "We are going home," he said. "To Oak Park?" Claire asked, her voice small and fragile. "To your home," Arthur replied. "Where the locks are strong and the numbers are honest." They walked out of Oak Towers together, leaving the darkness behind them. Arthur Sterling had rescued his daughter, but more importantly, he had allowed her to finally see the truth. The bridge had been burned, and as they drove back toward the quiet streets of Maple Drive, Arthur knew that for the first time in 18 months, the ledger of his family was finally beginning to balance. For months later, the house at 42 Maple Drive sounds different. It is no longer the suffocating silence of endurance or the jagged noise of conflict. It is a house that breathes with the steady rhythmic pulse of a life reclaimed. Every Wednesday afternoon at 3 o'clock, the living room holds 12 people in borrowed folding chairs sharing coffee and stories that were once buried in shame. Arthur calls it the Wednesday Audit. It is a support group for seniors who have faced financial exploitation, and today they are discussing the subtle red flags of a predator. Barbara Peterson and Arthur Coleman are there along with 10 others who have found the courage to speak their truths. Arthur facilitates the meetings with the same precision he once used at the Internal Revenue Service, but now his focus is on emotional solvency. He teaches them that being a victim is not a reflection of their intelligence but a testament to their capacity for trust. When the meeting ends at 5 o'clock, Barbara stops by his chair and tells him that he has turned his pain into a lighthouse for the community. Arthur simply smiles, knowing that the best way to honor Martha is to ensure that no one else in Oak Park is made to feel small in their own home. The legal ledger is finally balanced. Julian Vance accepted a plea deal in January to avoid a lengthy trial that would have included 10 minutes of high-definition footage of his violent breakdown. He is currently serving 18 months in the county jail, followed by 5 years of strict probation and mandatory psychological counseling. When Sam Kaplan called with the news, Arthur felt no surge of triumph, only a quiet sense of closure. Julian was a liability that had been properly liquidated and the case was closed. Claire has moved into a small, quiet apartment near the hospital. She spent 2 months in intensive therapy learning how to deconstruct the manipulation Julian had woven into the fabric of her life. She visits Arthur twice a week and they eat dinner at the kitchen table using Martha's favorite sunflower plates. The conversations are no longer mechanical. They are honest and sometimes painful, but they are real. One evening, as she helps him clear the table, Claire takes his hand and tells him she is sorry for every moment she stayed silent while he was being erased. Arthur tells her that the only thing that matters is that the books are now open and the truth is no longer a hidden entry. Arthur walks into the living room and sits in his leather armchair. He reaches for the remote and turns on the television. A new black cable is securely connected and the screen hums to life with the familiar voice of a narrator discussing the history of ancient civilizations. He watches the documentary with a sense of profound peace. The house is a fortress once more, but the doors are open to those who earn the right to enter. He looks at the photograph of Martha on the mantle and whispers that he kept his promise. He took care of their daughter and he took care of himself. This story of Arthur Sterling teaches us that dignity is not a gift given by others, but a boundary we must claim for ourselves. It reminds us that standing up for the truth is never an act of selfishness, but an act of survival. We learn that sometimes protecting the ones we love means allowing them to face the harsh light of reality so they can finally see the predator standing in the shadows. Values like self-respect and the courage to protect one's legacy are the true assets of a life well lived. If this story touched your heart or reminded you of the strength we all carry within us, please consider subscribing to our channel. Your support allows us to continue sharing these powerful narratives of justice and redemption. Please like this video and share it with someone who might need to hear that it is never too late to reclaim their power. We want to hear from you. How did this story of the final audit make you feel? Have you ever had to stand up to someone who tried to make you feel small, or have you witnessed the struggle of a loved one facing similar challenges? Please share your thoughts and your personal stories in the comments below. We read every message because your experiences are the heartbeat of this community, and we want to listen to the feelings from deep within your hearts. We wish everyone watching this video today excellent health, a joyful life, and a peaceful heart every single day. May you always find the strength to balance your own ledgers with honesty and grace. Thank you for your time and your attention. Goodbye for now, and we look forward to seeing you in the next video.